Donald Trump has spent 4 years claiming he alone understands how to handle Iran. Yet on March 12, 2026, his administration quietly abandoned every major pillar of what was supposedly his comprehensive Iran strategy. The retreat wasn't announced in a press conference or explained in a policy memo. Instead, it emerged through a series of bureaucratic reversals, cancelled military deployments, and diplomatic signals so contradictory that even long-time Trump defenders at the Heritage Foundation admitted they couldn't explain the administration's actual objectives. What we're witnessing isn't strategic flexibility or complex negotiation tactics. It's the systematic collapse of an approach that never actually existed beyond campaign rhetoric and televised bluster. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand exactly why the so-called maximum pressure campaign was always a performance masking fundamental policy incoherence, and why that incoherence has now left the United States with dramatically weakened leverage across the entire Middle East. The immediate trigger for this revelation came on March 9th when Reuters reported that the Pentagon had cancelled planned naval deployments to the Persian Gulf that were supposedly central to maintaining pressure on Tehran. Two carrier strike groups that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had described just 6 weeks earlier as essential deterrent forces were quietly reassigned to the Pacific theater with no public explanation. The withdrawal represented the largest reduction in American naval presence in the Gulf since 2003, yet the White House press office refused to acknowledge the deployment changes during the March 11th briefing. When pressed by Associated Press correspondent Zeke Miller about the apparent reversal, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt claimed she was unaware of any change in Iran policy and suggested questions be directed to the Department of Defense, which itself declined to comment on operational deployments. This circular non-response pattern is itself revealing, because coherent strategies don't require this level of bureaucratic evasion when basic questions emerge about force posture changes. The naval withdrawal would be significant enough on its own, but it coincided with 3 other major policy reversals that collectively dismantle what Trump had claimed was his integrated approach to Iranian containment. On March 8th, the State Department approved sanctions relief for Chinese companies purchasing Iranian oil, effectively abandoning the enforcement mechanism that was supposedly preventing Tehran from accessing hard currency through petroleum exports. The sanctions relief came without any corresponding Iranian concessions on nuclear development, missile programs, or regional proxy forces. According to analysis from the Institute for the Study of War published March 13th, Chinese purchases of Iranian crude oil have already increased by approximately 42% since the sanctions enforcement pause, translating to an additional $800 million flowing into Iranian government coffers over just the past 30 days. The financial impact directly contradicts every stated objective of the maximum pressure approach, yet generated no explanation from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about why enforcement priorities had shifted. Simultaneously, multiple diplomatic sources confirmed to the Financial Times on March 10th that the administration had quietly dropped its demand that any negotiated agreement with Iran address the regime's ballistic missile program and support for regional militias, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and various Iraqi Shia groups. These demands had been consistently described as non-negotiable elements, distinguishing Trump's approach from the Obama-era nuclear agreement. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz had stated explicitly in a February 4th interview with Fox News that any future agreement must comprehensively address what he called Iran's destabilizing regional activities and weapons development programs. Yet, according to the Financial Times reporting, American diplomats meeting with European counterparts in Brussels indicated willingness to accept a narrow agreement focused exclusively on uranium enrichment levels, essentially reverting to the framework Trump had spent years condemning as dangerously insufficient. The fourth reversal emerged through military intelligence channels rather than official statements. Defense Intelligence Agency assessments obtained by The Washington Post indicate that the administration has ceased sharing certain categories of intelligence about Iranian nuclear facilities with Israeli defense officials, a practice that had been standard since at least 2018. The intelligence sharing reduction appears designed to limit Israel's capacity for independent military action against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, suggesting the administration wants to constrain potential Israeli operations that might complicate American diplomatic flexibility. This represents a particularly dramatic shift because Trump had consistently positioned himself as Israel's strongest supporter and had previously encouraged closer military cooperation specifically around the Iranian nuclear threat. The fact that this intelligence policy change was implemented without public announcement indicates awareness that it would be politically controversial among the Republican base that views support for Israeli security as non-negotiable. Each of these four reversals individually would signal significant policy recalibration. Occurring simultaneously within a 5-day window, they reveal something more fundamental than tactical adjustment. They expose that there never was a coherent strategic framework connecting Trump's Iran rhetoric to sustainable policy outcomes. The maximum pressure campaign was always more performance than plan, more theatrical than strategic, designed to create the appearance of toughness for domestic political consumption, while lacking the institutional architecture and diplomatic coherence necessary to actually modify Iranian behavior or protect American interests. And now that the performance has proven unsustainable, we're seeing the predictable collapse into policy incoherence that leaves the United States in a demonstrably weaker position than when Trump took office in January 2025. Understanding how we arrived at this point requires examining what Trump actually inherited versus what he claimed to inherit regarding Iran policy. When Trump returned to the presidency in January 2025, Iranian nuclear development had advanced significantly during the 2021-24 period when Trump was out of office. According to International Atomic Energy Agency reports from December 2024, Iran had accumulated approximately 140 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, far beyond what the 2015 nuclear agreement permitted and approaching weapons-grade concentration. Additionally, Iran had installed advanced centrifuge cascades at both Natanz and Fordow facilities, dramatically reducing the technical timeline required to produce weapons-grade material if leadership decided to pursue that path. These developments occurred during the period when Trump's first-term withdrawal from the nuclear agreement had eliminated international monitoring mechanisms and diplomatic engagement channels that might have constrained Iranian activities. Trump's campaign rhetoric consistently blamed the Biden administration for Iranian nuclear advances, while promising that his return would immediately restore American leverage and force Tehran into comprehensive concessions. In an October 2024 interview with Hugh Hewitt, Trump claimed he would have a new Iran agreement within 90 days of taking office, suggesting that Iranian leadership understood he represented a fundamentally different negotiating environment than Biden. This confident timeline was always detached from geopolitical reality because it presumed Iranian leadership would voluntarily surrender strategic capabilities in response to American demands, backed primarily by sanctions that Tehran had already learned to partially circumvent through Chinese and Russian economic cooperation. The 90-day promise exemplified Trump's consistent pattern of treating complex international negotiations as equivalent to real estate deals where superior negotiating ability alone determines outcomes regardless of underlying power dynamics or opposing party interests. The actual policy Trump implemented upon returning to office consisted almost entirely of symbolic gestures designed to signal toughness without creating sustainable pressure or advancing concrete objectives. The administration reimposed certain sanctions that had been temporarily lifted during Biden's tenure and increased naval presence in the Persian Gulf through the carrier deployments that have now been cancelled. But these actions lacked integration into any broader strategic framework that might translate pressure into negotiating leverage. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published analysis on February 28, noting that Trump's initial Iran moves appeared disconnected from diplomatic engagement strategy, raising questions about whether the administration possessed clear objectives beyond demonstrating departure from Biden's approach. That analysis has proven prescient because we now see the pressure tactics being abandoned without having achieved any of their stated purposes. The naval deployment reversal particularly illustrates the disconnect between Trump's public posturing and actual strategic commitment. Maintaining significant carrier presence in the Persian Gulf requires substantial resource allocation and creates operational constraints for other military priorities, particularly regarding China in the Pacific theater. Trump has simultaneously claimed that confronting Chinese military expansion represents his top national security priority, while also insisting on demonstrating maximum pressure against Iran through forward naval presence. These objectives compete for limited carrier assets, and the March 9th deployment cancellations reveal that when forced to choose between rhetorical commitments, the administration prioritized Pacific posture over Gulf presence. That's actually a reasonable strategic choice given the relative threats, but it directly contradicts months of statements about Iranian containment being essential to regional stability and American credibility. The gap between rhetoric and resource allocation exposes that the Iran tough talk was never backed by genuine strategic commitment. The sanctions relief for Chinese oil purchases represents an even more direct abandonment of stated policy objectives, because it was the enforcement of secondary sanctions against third-party purchasers that actually created economic pressure on Iran during Trump's first term. Tehran has always been able to sell oil to willing buyers. The question was whether those buyers would face consequences that made the purchases economically or politically unattractive. When the United States vigorously enforced secondary sanctions between 2018 and 2020, Chinese companies reduced Iranian oil imports significantly because the cost of American market access exceeded the benefits of discounted Iranian crude. The March 8 sanctions relief decision signals that the administration no longer considers that enforcement worth the diplomatic friction with Beijing, effectively prioritizing Chinese relationship management over Iranian economic pressure. Again, that might be a defensible strategic choice, if articulated as such, but it fundamentally contradicts the maximum pressure framework that supposedly represented Trump's distinctive approach to Iran. The decision to drop ballistic missile and regional proxy force demands from potential negotiations is particularly revealing because these issues were the centerpiece of Trump's critique of the Obama nuclear agreement. From 2015 through 2020, Trump and his supporters consistently argued that the nuclear deal's fatal flaw was its failure to address Iran's broader destabilizing activities beyond uranium enrichment. They claimed a proper agreement would comprehensively constrain Iranian regional influence and weapons development, not merely delay nuclear weapons capability. Yet, when actually attempting to negotiate, the administration discovered what Obama's team had already learned, which is that Iran will not negotiate away conventional military capabilities and regional influence as part of nuclear talks, and that insisting on such linkage simply prevents any agreement from emerging. The choice to quietly abandon these demands reveals they were always more useful as critique of democratic diplomacy than as achievable negotiating objectives. But dropping them without explanation or acknowledgement means abandoning the very rationale Trump used to justify withdrawing from the existing agreement in his first term. The reduction in intelligence sharing with Israel completes the picture of strategic incoherence by revealing the administration's awareness that its policy contradictions might provoke Israeli actions the United States no longer wants to support. Israel has consistently maintained that it will act independently to prevent Iranian nuclear weapons capability if diplomatic efforts fail and American security guarantees prove insufficient. During Trump's first term and throughout his 2024 campaign, he encouraged this posture and suggested American and Israeli policies were fully aligned on Iran. But now, facing the reality that his diplomatic approach has failed to constrain Iranian nuclear development, Trump apparently wants to prevent Israeli military action that might complicate American flexibility or trigger regional conflict the United States lacks appetite to manage. Reducing intelligence sharing is designed to increase operational difficulty for potential Israeli strikes, buying diplomatic space for American negotiations that have already abandoned most of their stated objectives. This puts Israel in the worst possible position, facing an advancing Iranian nuclear program while receiving reduced intelligence support and unclear signals about American backing for defensive or preemptive action. What makes this comprehensive policy collapse particularly significant is its implications beyond Iran itself. American credibility in the Middle East has always rested partly on perception that Washington maintains consistent strategic commitments, even when administration changes. Arab partners in the Gulf, Jordan, and elsewhere cooperate with American objectives based on assessment that the United States will remain engaged and reliable, despite domestic political fluctuations. Trump's Iran reversal directly undermines that credibility because it demonstrates that even his most emphatic campaign commitments evaporate when confronted with implementation challenges. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are already recalibrating their security strategies based on reduced confidence in American staying power, with both countries pursuing independent diplomatic engagement with Tehran and diversifying their security partnerships to include greater cooperation with China and Russia. These adjustments are rational responses to demonstrated American unreliability, but they weaken the regional alignment structure that has underpinned American influence since the 1991 Gulf War. The reversals also eliminate any negotiating leverage the United States might have used to actually constrain Iranian nuclear development, because Tehran now understands that American pressure tactics are unsustainable and that Washington is more desperate for agreement than Iran is. Effective coercive diplomacy requires the target believing that failure to make concessions will result in escalating costs they wish to avoid. But when the United States publicly abandons its pressure mechanisms before negotiations seriously begin, it signals that American tolerance for the status quo is lower than Iranian tolerance for continued sanctions and isolation. That dynamic gives Tehran every incentive to wait out American diplomatic initiatives while continuing nuclear development, knowing that Washington's position will likely weaken further as domestic political pressures mount and regional complications multiply. The Institute for the Study of War Assessment, published March 14th, explicitly warned that the recent American policy reversals have probably eliminated any near-term possibility of diplomatic progress on nuclear constraints because Iran no longer fears consequences of non-compliance. From a psychological standpoint, Trump's Iran policy collapse reflects his consistent inability to distinguish between campaign performance and governance substance. Throughout his political career, Trump has demonstrated exceptional skill at identifying issues that resonate with particular audiences and crafting compelling narratives about his unique capacity to solve complex problems. The Iran issue fit this pattern perfectly because it allowed him to position himself as simultaneously tougher than Obama and more strategically sophisticated than establishment Republicans. During campaigns, these narratives require no actual implementation or accountability for results, making them cost-free vehicles for building political support. But governance requires translating narrative into policy that achieves stated objectives despite institutional constraints, opposing interests, and resource limitations. Trump has never successfully made that translation on any complex foreign policy issue, because doing so would require acknowledging that his campaign critiques were oversimplified and that problems are genuinely difficult rather than merely mishandled by previous leaders. The pattern we're observing with Iran mirrors what occurred during Trump's first term regarding North Korea, Afghanistan, China trade, and NATO burden sharing. In each case, Trump identified legitimate policy problems, offered bold rhetorical solutions, generated extensive media coverage of his distinctive approach, then quietly abandoned or reversed course when the promised breakthroughs failed to materialize. With North Korea, maximum pressure gave way to summit diplomacy that produced no denuclearization progress. With Afghanistan, criticism of endless wars gave way to a withdrawal agreement that enabled Taliban victory. With China, promises of transformative trade deals gave way to limited agreements that left fundamental economic relationships unchanged. With NATO, demands for radical burden sharing increases gave way to modest defense spending commitments from European allies. The consistent element across these cases is the gap between rhetoric and results, the substitution of performance for policy, the ultimate abandonment of stated objectives without acknowledgement or accountability. What distinguishes the Iran case is how rapidly the collapse occurred and how completely it dismantled every element of Trump's supposed strategy. Past reversals at least attempted to maintain the appearance of partial success, or could be rationalized as tactical adjustments within continuing commitment. But the March 2026 Iran reversals leave literally nothing remaining of the maximum pressure framework. Naval forces are withdrawn, sanctions enforcement is abandoned, negotiating demands are dropped, and intelligence sharing is reduced. There is no coherent policy remaining at all, just ad hoc responses to immediate pressures without connection to strategic objectives or recognition of how abandoning pressure tactics eliminates leverage for future negotiations. This represents perhaps the purest example we've seen of the gap between Trump's self-presentation as master strategist and the actual incoherence of his governance approach when expertise and sustained commitment are required. Looking forward, the consequences of this policy collapse will extend far beyond Iran itself and will likely shape Middle Eastern dynamics for years, regardless of what happens in the 2028 American election. Iran now knows it can advance its nuclear program without facing sustainable American pressure, encouraging continued development toward weapons capability if leadership decides that serves regime security. Regional actors know American commitments are unreliable, even under supposedly hawkish administrations, accelerating the security independence and great power hedging that weakens American influence. Israel faces advancing Iranian nuclear capabilities, with reduced intelligence support and unclear signals about American backing, increasing the probability of independent Israeli military action that could trigger regional conflict. And American adversaries globally observe that even Trump's most emphatic policy commitments evaporate under implementation pressure, emboldening challenges to American positions on issues from Taiwan to Ukraine to global trade. The specific Iranian nuclear timeline concerns are particularly acute because every passing month of uranium enrichment and centrifuge installation shortens the technical breakout period required to produce weapons-grade material. The International Atomic Energy Agency's most recent assessment indicates Iran could theoretically produce sufficient, highly enriched uranium for a nuclear device within approximately 2 weeks if political leadership directed such action, though weaponization and delivery system integration would require additional time. This dramatically compressed timeline means any future American pressure campaign would need to be extraordinarily coercive to roll back existing capabilities, far more aggressive than anything Trump attempted, even at maximum pressure peak. Having abandoned relatively modest pressure tactics in March 2026, the administration has made more coercive approaches, even less credible, because everyone now knows Trump retreats from his stated positions when they prove costly or complex to maintain. The domestic political implications are equally significant because Trump's Iran policy collapse directly contradicts the competence narrative that sustains his political appeal among Republican base voters. The core Trump brand promise involves superior deal-making ability and willingness to project strength that supposedly weak establishment politicians lack. Iran was a perfect test case for this promise because Trump had spent years criticizing existing approaches and claiming he alone understood how to force Iranian concessions. The comprehensive failure of his approach, occurring barely 3 months into his second term, should theoretically damage his credibility regarding foreign policy competence. Whether that actually occurs depends on whether alternative information sources reach Republican audiences and whether Trump can successfully shift blame to bureaucratic sabotage, Iranian bad faith, or other external factors beyond his control. Past performance suggests he will largely succeed in avoiding accountability among committed supporters. But the policy failure remains objective fact, regardless of how successfully it gets politically managed. What we're left with is a textbook case of what happens when campaign rhetoric meets governing reality, without any underlying policy substance or strategic coherence to bridge the gap. Trump promised maximum pressure that would force Iranian capitulation. He delivered symbolic gestures that created no sustainable leverage and have now been abandoned without achieving any stated objectives. The United States is materially worse off regarding Iranian nuclear development than when Trump took office. Regional allies trust American commitments less, and adversaries believe American pressure tactics are hollow. These are measurable strategic failures with concrete consequences, not subjective judgments about negotiating style or diplomatic approach. They result directly from treating complex international security challenges as opportunities for performance rather than problems requiring expertise, sustained commitment, and realistic assessment of what leverage can actually achieve. The Iran case won't be the last time we observe this pattern during Trump's second term. Every campaign promise regarding foreign policy or domestic challenges that proved useful for building political support will eventually collide with implementation reality. Some will collapse as rapidly and completely as Iran policy has. Others may sustain themselves somewhat longer through bureaucratic momentum or reduced scrutiny. But the underlying dynamic remains constant because it flows from Trump's fundamental inability to distinguish between identifying problems and solving them, between criticism and construction, between campaign narrative and governing substance. That inability produces policy incoherence that generates real costs for American interests and global stability, costs that accumulate regardless of how successfully they get politically managed or rhetorically obscured. And understanding that dynamic is essential for making sense of the chaotic trajectory we're observing across every dimension of this administration's approach to the world. So here's what you need to understand as this situation continues developing. Trump never had an Iran plan beyond campaign talking points and theatrical pressure tactics. The maximum pressure framework was always more performance than policy, designed to signal toughness to domestic audiences rather than achieve sustainable strategic objectives. And now that the performance has proven unsustainable, we're witnessing complete policy collapse that leaves American interests demonstrably weakened and Iranian nuclear development advancing unconstrained. This isn't about whether you support Trump politically or prefer alternative approaches. It's about the objective gap between what was promised and what has been delivered, and about the real consequences that gap creates for American security and global stability. As you watch this unfold over coming months, pay attention to whether any coherent policy eventually emerges or whether we continue seeing ad hoc reactions disguised as strategic flexibility. The evidence so far suggests the latter, and that should concern anyone who cares about competent governance regardless of partisan affiliation. What's your assessment of how this policy collapse will affect regional dynamics over the next 12 months? Share your perspective in the comments, because understanding these developments requires bringing together diverse analytical viewpoints and staying focused on evidence rather than partisan narratives. We've just walked through how Trump's Iran approach has systematically collapsed across naval deployments, sanctions enforcement, negotiating demands, and intelligence sharing, revealing that there never was a coherent strategic framework connecting his campaign rhetoric to sustainable policy outcomes. That gap between performance and substance has now produced measurable strategic costs, including reduced American leverage, weakened regional credibility, and accelerated Iranian nuclear development, all occurring barely 3 months into Trump's second term. Presented by TGN, thank you for choosing us.